period in the whole span of human history. 50 years ago, this Messerschmitt 410 was one of the tools of aggression with which Adolf Hitler planned to subdue the Western world. In 1942, hundreds of Me410s darted through the skies of Europe with one purpose and one purpose only: to destroy the men and the machines of war that encircled Germany. Appropriately, these aircraft and the line from which they sprang were known by Luftwaffe pilots as the destroyers. What makes the destroyer story so important is that in many ways its evolution mirrors the fortunes, needs and misfortunes of the Luftwaffe itself. Destroyers were not one particular aircraft, but rather an entire class. And because they were put to so many uses, escort, tank destroyer, night fighter, they may have been the most versatile, most ambitious planes of the war. The destroyer line was first incarnated in the Messerschmitt Bf-110. Originally intended as a bomber escort, the 110 embarked on its maiden flight in 1936. But it took several years of hard work before the twin-engine craft was ready for service. In the years leading up to the war, the destroyer's greatest champion was none other than Luftwaffe Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. This former World War I ace, steadily preparing his forces for the inevitable conflict, keenly recognized the ascendance of air power and intended gathering the most formidable arsenal the world had ever seen. This is a Junkers 86. As one of the Luftwaffe's first monoplane bombers, its survival hung precariously on the armaments it carried into battle. That vulnerability led military planners to search for ways of giving expensive bombers like the 86 a better chance of coming back. When more powerful engines arrived on the scene, there was great hope that the next generation of German bombers might actually be able to outrun enemy fighters. The Dornier Do-17 was the manifestation of that optimism. Constructed with very light armor, the plane was for a bomber really quite nimble. Because of its curious shape, the Do-17 was quickly dubbed the flying pencil by the Luftwaffe pilots who flew her. The Dornier's closest peer at the time was a highly advanced bomber called the Heinkel He-111. German strategists fantasized that in the coming conflict, fleets of such warplanes would rule the skies, and soon thereafter the ground below. But with these hopes came concern. Lessons in Spain, paid for in airmen's lives, had taught the Luftwaffe that these speedy bombers were still very vulnerable to enemy fire. The solution was clear. Bomber fleets would need long-range escort fighters to accompany them. Only then could the slashing thrusts of attacking enemy fighters be blunted. The idea of a long-range escort fighter was not entirely new. In America, Bell Aircraft had struggled with the concept and come up with an answer of its own. The extreme range required for such missions would only be feasible with large twin-engined aircraft, even bigger than many bombers of the time. The Airacuda was Bell's first endeavor in this direction and displayed several novel features, including propellers placed at the rear of the wings. This allowed the front of each engine nacelle to pack the hidden sting of a gunner and a large caliber cannon. The massive fighter never made it onto the production line, but the company's next product, the P-39 Airacobra, did go on to carry thousands of Russian pilots into combat on the Eastern Front. But with existing technology, an effective dual-engined fighter was still not feasible. At the time, technology dictated that aircraft, high-performance aircraft, be constructed almost entirely from metal. Aluminium, steel, that was the stuff that military planes should be made of. In aviation manufacturing, wood was rapidly being relegated to the past. And by the late 1930s, that transition was almost complete. Yet there were still some who persisted in favoring the lightness provided by wood construction. Future designs would vindicate them in their stand. This remarkable aircraft was designed by the famous Dutchman Anthony Fokker. Designated model G1, it was better known as the mower. And unfortunately for its targets, that had nothing to do with the sound it made, but rather indicated just what its guns would do to anything in its way. Twin-engined, multi-seated, multi-missioned. It fitted the destroyer concept perfectly. Fokker's design was extremely agile, something few destroyers could really boast. Ironically, this was partly due to the plane's wooden wings. Unfortunately for the Dutch, very few were built by the time of the German invasion. September the 1st, 1939. German troops swarm across the Polish border in bold mobile strikes that stun the panicked defenders. And a new kind of warfare is born. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Polish lines are rapidly penetrated by highly mobile German panzer divisions. Under intense aerial bombardment, soldiers and civilians alike are sent reeling by a new German terror weapon, the Stuka dive bomber. Germany's twin-engine bombers, unchallenged by Poland's antiquated air force, fly with impunity and wreak destruction on Polish cities. Messerschmitt 110s, freed of their escort duties, are able to assume an offensive role as ground attack aircraft. But Poland was only the first. Soon Nazi aggression consumed Norway, Belgium, Holland, and France. Nations with inadequate air forces, unable to challenge a Luftwaffe that dominated the skies over every single battle it entered. These were all conflicts relatively close to the fatherland. Many airfields were quickly taken by German ground troops. Others were lost by simple incompetence. But as the war spread, Allied commanders learned hard lessons. There would be no more easy victories for the Luftwaffe. The next target was Britain, saved from the fate of the rest of Europe by a narrow band of water called the English Channel. And just as important, the British had the Royal Air Force. If German bombers were to bring England to her knees, Messerschmitt destroyers would have to escort them. The British had one other quite ingenious card up their sleeves: radar. With it, RAF fighters could locate incoming bombers almost invariably. A showdown of sorts had arrived between the RAF Spitfire and Goering's unproven escort. Caught momentarily without escort, German bombers like this HE-111 were easy prey. From nearby, 110s close in to defend the bomber, and with the advantage of height, target the Spitfire. But this film shot from a 110's gun camera illustrates the destroyer's basic flaw. Over 60 miles per hour slower than the British plane, they could never outmaneuver the single-engine fighters. The Spitfire simply flies out of reach. In a few desperate days, the theory of Goering's destroyers was tried, tested, and abandoned.
We will return.
Throughout the war, Goering left much of the Luftwaffe planning to another fighter ace from the First World War, Ernst Udet, seen here on the left.
Goering asked him. Goering was his comrade in the fighter squadron of Richthofen, and he asked him, or maybe he forced him in, to the new German Air Force. Like, you have to come. You, as a hero of World War I, you have to come to this world, and he did. And he was lucky, and his life was flying. And then later on, he was put in a position where he had to plan all the new developments and the new policy where we go in our armament, in our equipment. And this was maybe a too heavy load on his shoulders. And then I think, you know, he was a wide and world-open cosmopolitan. And I can imagine that he was not too happy in this very strict political situation he was put